Starvation's Grip, a Wizard, a Duke, and an Amulet's Power. By Elton Gar. Amy crawled out from the small culvert, where she had been hiding for almost a month. It had been a nearly perfect hiding spot. There were enough cracks in the masonry to let the light in, and to let her see out. And she had gathered enough straw and rags to make a reasonably comfortable bed. There were even a few grooves that filled with water when it rained. As she slipped forward, she pulled her long mud-covered cloak around her, trying to hide a face that showed no signs of starvation. As soon as the street was empty, she rushed to the nearest of the large barrels of water. She stuck her head into the water, drinking as much water as she could, as fast as she could. Then, once she could not drink anymore, she stuck the wood mug into the barrel. She turned, planning to return to her hiding spot, when a bony old hand grabbed her wrist. The siege hadn't been kind to the old woman. Her skin was thin and her eyes sunk into her head. But it was the crazed look in her eyes that terrified Amy.
"You look well fed,"
the old crone said. Amy pulled her arm away from the weak grasp of the woman, but she bounced off an old man with the leather apron of a blacksmith, though it hung loose.
"She looks as if she's been eating well,"
he said, touching the hammer on his belt.
"I need to see the Duke,"
Amy said. The Duke was a fair man, but even if he wasn't, the possibility that she had food would force him to listen. And once she explained the magic, the worst he would do would be to take her family's amulet. That would put her in the same position as everyone else, except that she hadn't needed to eat for the last 3 months.
"She wants to confess,"
the old woman said, laughing as she spoke. But though this woman wasn't entirely sane, she was still drawing attention, and a small crowd of gaunt people began to shamble towards the center of the walled city. The exhaustion of near starvation seemed to be pushed away by the sight of something happening, and people began to appear out of buildings and side streets. They moved slowly, and some of them simply stopped and sat on the ground, too exhausted to continue. But the crowd grew, and Amy kept her head down and hurried forward towards the keep and the Duke. The first soldier she saw was at the gate of the keep, at the center of the town. There were 2 just outside a small open door, and a half a dozen more on the walls. They all had spears and darts, but none showed any signs of expecting a fight. The siege had been going for months. They wouldn't risk the lives now, when they were nearing their victory. The soldiers looked less sickly, though the guards still stood slowly, almost leaning on the spear.
"There is no food here. Move along,"
the soldier said. There were some murmurs in the crowd, and Amy suspected that the announcement that there was no food was something people hadn't been expecting. But rather than walk away, a man shoved Amy forward as forcefully as his weakened condition allowed, and he said,
"This girl's been stealing food."
"I have been doing no such thing,"
Amy said, but her moment of indignation died as the eyes of everyone, including a dozen soldiers, all fell on her. She was just a refugee who had fled to the city, and a girl at that. There was no reason any of them would believe her. The crowd got louder, and one of the women grabbed Amy's hair and pulled on it, but before things got too dangerous, a guard on the wall said,
"Bring the girl into the keep. We will let the Duke decide."
The soldier grabbed Amy, helping to pull her past him, a bit of hair being pulled out in the process, and she reached down, touching the small amulet hanging around her neck. A dozen silver wires twisted around a golden seed and hanging around her neck on a silver chain. If she lost that, she'd have no proof that she wasn't stealing. Once she was behind the door, the guard shut it and said,
"You know the punishment for stealing food."
She had been avoiding people since she arrived, and that included those delivering messages from the Duke, so she had heard nothing about punishments, but she suspected she did, so she said,
"I think I know."
"You may leave the city, so long as you do it before the Duke judges you. I'll even have the soldiers escort you to the gate. No one wants to see an execution just because someone didn't want to starve."
It was a kind offer, but it also terrified Amy. This soldier clearly believed she had been stealing food. But she had her family's amulet. They'd have to believe that she hadn't stolen food once she showed it to them. The soldier waited for an answer. Amy almost asked to leave. There was an army outside the city, but they were most interested in keeping supplies out of the city. They were unlikely to care if a girl wanted to leave. But she looked at the soldier and said,
I didn't steal food.
He looked at her carefully, said something under his breath, and then began to walk her through the keep. She had never been inside the huge stone walls that dominated the center of the town. But now that she was here, she was impressed by how much they fit into it. There were doors and wooden buildings everywhere, and far more people. There was a blacksmith working on a piece of armor, and even a few thin horses eating grass. There was a narrow stone stairway on the outside of the building. There were no rails, but she had little choice in going up them. One guard walked in front of her and another behind. The door was also awkward. The guard had to pull it open from the side because it opened outward and there was no room to stand. It seemed an odd design until she imagined the soldiers outside trying to get into this place, and it made far more sense. It was a small stone room with a half a dozen windows. All of them were wide on the inside, but became narrow at the edge of the wall. But she barely had time to think about how strange that was. There was a large table in the center of the room with a map of the entire city, and behind it was the Duke, a tall man dressed in clothes that hung loosely on him. There was also a short man with long white hair. He was sitting at the table looking at a book.
What is it?
The Duke said, looking up from the table. His once perfect beard was patchy and his eyes sunken. Amy looked at him and saw that she should have come here on her own. The amulet would have been more useful in the hands of the Duke.
This girl has been stealing food.
The guard at the front said.
I have not been stealing food.
Amy said, blushing as she spoke, but if she didn't speak for herself, they would just assume it was true.
Women may not speak to the Duke,
The small gray-haired man said, looking up from his book and catching her with violet eyes. She had heard the stories of her family's amulet, and violet eyes were one of the most important parts.
I must explain myself.
Amy said, and her hand involuntarily went to her throat and the amulet.
All food in the city was to be given over to be added to the food stores. How do you explain having eaten if you did not steal?
The Duke said, but he gave a significant look to the man with the book. Amy didn't understand what that look meant.
I didn't. My family has an amulet. This amulet,
She said, and she held it up. The gray-haired man really looked at her for the first time, and then stood up and walked over to her. As he touched the amulet, the wires seemed to twist and the golden seed at the center became visible, floating perfectly at the center.
you should have brought this to us earlier.
The gray-haired man said.
Let her be, Yurik. She is here now, and perhaps she can be useful.
The Duke said, and Amy recognized the name. There was only one wizard in the city, and this was him.
What does it do?
Yurik said.
so long as I wear it, I don't need food.
Amy said. Yurik looked at it for another second, then dropped it and said.
No wizard would waste their time. It would take 10 times the effort it was worth, and anyone who could afford it would simply buy food.
My family didn't buy it. It was a gift.
Amy said. She didn't know anything about magic, but she had heard the story more than enough times.
And who, might I ask, gave you this gift? I am the only wizard in the city.
Yurik said.
It was generations ago. My great-great-grandfather saw a man in rags fleeing from an angry group of villagers. He hid him in his wagon and took him to our farm. The man was injured, and my grandparents took care of him. While he rested, he weaved together silver and gold. When he was healthy, he gave it to them as a gift and explained that since they had protected and fed him, he would do the same, and so long as they wore it, they would never go hungry.
The Duke looked at the old man, who said.
It is possible. Our records don't go back that far, but that would be around the time of the Great Purge. Perhaps this family protected one of the wizard lords and was rewarded.
Then the question isn't whether it's true, but how we can use it.
The Duke said, and Amy felt a weight lift off her.
You're welcome to use the amulet, but it will only keep you from getting more hungry.
Amy said.
Could you make more?
The Duke asked, looking at the wizard.
With this as an example and the right material, I could. But magic isn't quick, and the amulet is difficult magic. If I pushed myself, I could make one a week.
The wizard said.
We have plenty of gold and silver. You should start today.
The Duke said. It seemed too little too late for Amy, and so she wasn't surprised when the wizard said,
A few dozen of them early in the siege may have given us a few extra days, but even if I could make one a day, most of the city would have starved to death before we had enough to matter.
Then what do you suggest?
the Duke said. The wizard looked at Amy and said,
Perhaps this young girl can be of some use. But she'll have to be cleaned up.
Amy took a step back, but the guard put his hand on her shoulder, keeping her from fleeing. Dressed in a thick, colorless woolen dress, Amy felt even younger than 13 and entirely useless. She didn't even have the amulet that was hung around the Duke's neck for safekeeping until it could be returned to her. That she looked and felt entirely unimportant was the point. Or so the wizard said. Amy could only pray to the gods that he was right, as she slipped out of the small sally gate and walked unarmed towards the large collection of tents and armed men who had kept everyone trapped in the city for months, attempting and succeeding in starving them. Approaching the enemies was the most dangerous part of the plan, though the wizard, who didn't seem to care much about how Amy felt about the plan, assured the Duke that it could work even if they killed her. But everyone agreed it would be better if they didn't. A tall man on a huge horse rode out from among the tents as she approached. He held his hand on the huge curved sword at his belt, but didn't draw it. Amy saw symbols in that armor that looked similar to the words carved into the golden seed of her amulet, but it didn't feel the same.
Is Duke Levann sending out little girls to beg for him now?
The soldier said. The Duke had described the commander who had been left behind to mind the siege. According to the Duke, he was a wealthy man who had been given this command not because he was a good commander, but because it was assumed even he couldn't fail at such a simple command.
I just want to go home and see my family,
Amy said.
So, he's trying to be rid of people because he has no food to give them,
the commander said. He spoke loudly so that the surrounding soldiers would hear, but what she heard from them suggested they were aware enough to see what the commander hadn't.
Do I look starved to you? I have eaten well, but fear for my family. It is near time for them to plant their crops, and with so many soldiers fighting, they will need my help,
Amy said. It was true. They would plant crops soon, and there were less young men to help than in most years. The commander looked at her more carefully. She smiled at him, trying to make it look as if she was simply an oblivious young girl who was giving away some bit of information she wasn't supposed to.
You're telling me that everyone is eating as well as you?
The commander asked.
I think the troops have more, and it was getting exhausting eating the same thing every day. But why would he give me food while everyone else starves?
Amy asked. There was enough talking among the soldiers that soon the rumors would be everywhere. And as she looked more carefully, she saw just how tired the soldiers were. They hadn't been stuck inside the city, but they looked tired and hungry too.
It isn't possible to store enough food to feed an entire city for months.
He's been taxing our food for years, and he gathered more when he saw you coming. He's worried that the food will go bad before they can eat it. Meanwhile, my family is trying to survive without the food they stored up for winter.
The commander turned his horse away with her, seeming to forget she was there. As he went, he yelled at a soldier, saying,
Prepare the army. We have wasted too much time on this minor city.
Amy stood at the edge of the enemy camp, ignored and uncertain what to do. So she turned and ran as fast as she could towards the city walls. Standing on top of the wall were 24 of the Duke's best archers and the Duke himself. They looked so exhausted she wasn't certain they could draw their bows, but no one followed her. She re-entered the sally port. It slammed behind her, and the Duke came down the wooden ladder slowly. He had regained a bit of his strength in the day that he had been wearing the amulet, but he still looked exhausted. Still, he removed the silver and gold and held it out.
I'll be fine for a few days. You should keep it for now, my lord,
Amy said. The Duke smiled and said,
Would you care to give a report then, soldier?
Amy blushed at that. She wasn't trying to imply that she was a soldier by using the Duke's honorific. She just didn't know how to speak to a lord. But he seemed to find it funny. Still, he came out to meet her, and she said,
I think he believed me. He told them to prepare the men.
Then we can only hope he is stupid enough to attack.
The Duke said.
But won't people be killed?
Amy said.
And the lost will be their soldiers. If they could have taken the city without a siege, they would have attacked with their full army. Our soldiers are hungry and tired, but against an army barely bigger than the one inside the city, they'll hold the walls.
A few hours later, Amy was in the Duke's map room with Wizard Uric. The wizard was currently wearing her amulet, while the Duke led the defense of the city. A light haze appeared around the wizard as the wooden soldiers on the map shifted and moved. The soldiers outside of the city had been painted blue, and each time they rushed towards the city walls, more of them fell. She didn't like to see them injured either, but each time more of them fell, the wizard chuckled until finally he said,
It turns out your trinket was useful after all. The enemy army has been broken thanks to it.
And thanks to her,
the Duke said, standing in the doorway. The wizard looked at her and harumphed, then said,
I suppose the girl gets some small bit of credit for not losing her nerve.
That's hardly a way to speak to a noble,
the Duke said. The wizard stood up and said,
What?
I'm having a scribe write the contract. In return for the service she has performed today, her family will be given the lands to the east of my province to develop.
But that is prime farmland,
the wizard said, and the map seemed to shift from the city to the Duke's lands. There was a large strip of land in red that bordered a section of blue land marked Uric.
And they are farmers. Farmers whose family has given service to our kingdom twice. Once to save your ancestor, and today to save hundreds from starvation,
the Duke said, and Amy sat in the Duke's wide wooden chair, too shocked to even be scared that he would be offended.